At one time or another, you've probably walked through a model home and seen the rooms trimmed in crown molding. Or maybe you've seen crown molding over the tops of the kitchen cabinets, and you've wondered how hard that would be to do it in your own home. Well, it's actually fairly easy. I'm Jim Heavey from Wood Magazine, and I'm going to show you a few simple techniques that will have you at your miter saw in no time. First, let's look at the crown molding itself. Now, crown molding comes in a variety of species and also different widths. The first one here is a piece of 3.5-inch crown molding. Pretty much standard, the kind of thing that you can find at home improvement stores and the like. This one's made out of poplar. Here's another crown piece made out of cherry, a much nicer wood. This is out of oak, with a slightly different profile at the bottom edge. This is a two-part piece of trim. This first part of crown is put up, and then the dental mold is attached afterwards. Looks really nice in some of the period homes. And here's a piece of crown molding that's much bigger. Now, these all look a little bit different, but they all have one thing in common, and those are the angles milled into the back of the molding. The bottom edge, which rests up against the wall, tilts into the room at 38 degrees, not 45. The top edge touches the ceiling at 52 degrees, again, not 45. It's these rather unique angles that can complicate your cutting. So what you have to do is go to your miter saw and make adjustments of the saw to either stand the molding up and cut it in the same plane that it would sit at the wall, or adjust the angles on that saw and cut the crown molding flat. And that's at the heart of this video. There are a variety of manufacturer jigs and some that you can make on your own. They help you cut crown molding on the saw. On the manufacturer jigs, some are metal brackets that come off the front to help you prop up that trim. On the plastic jigs, they work off both the left and the right-hand side that help stabilize that piece. And lastly, we've made them out of plywood that have just a wooden board across the front, again, that helps stabilize that piece of trim. But in all cases, they're taking a trim and they're taking the top edge here and putting that on the bottom and putting the bottom edge up against the fence. In the trades, we call this cutting the trim upside down and backwards. And the problems that always arise are cutting and stabilizing very long pieces, real wide pieces, and finally real small ones. The second method is one that I use. Instead of propping up the trim on the saw, I adjust the angles on the saw and cut that trim flat. And a closer look at the miter saw will show you how easy that is. Now, if you take a look at the miter scale, you're going to see a grouping of numbers. Next to 0, 15 degrees, 22.5, and 45 are positive stops called detents. They're set at the normal common angles. But there's another one between 22.5 and 45 that you may not realize what it's there for. 31.6 degrees. In this case, there's a positive stop there too. It may be noted by a positive stop, a thicker line, maybe the mark called CM, but 31.6 degrees is the miter setting for cutting crown molding on your miter saw. Now let's look at the bevel. On the back of the saw, there's a scale. It goes from 0 to 45. So it has a positive stop at 0 and at 45. But if you look between those two values, there's another little mark, in this case a small little arrow, set at 33.9 degrees. 33.9 is the bevel setting for cutting crown molding flat on your saw. The settings of 33.9 on the bevel and 31.6 on the miter are stamped into the saw to eliminate the calculations it would take to cut trim at 90 degrees when it sits away from the wall at 38 degrees. Laying trim flat on the saw also makes it much easier to stabilize long pieces. It's much easier to cut wider pieces that may not be able to stand up in a propped up jig. And lastly, the trim can be clamped here pretty easily, making cutting off small pieces much easier. To make the process of cutting crown molding flat on the miter saw all but mistake-proof, I'm going to show you how to make a set of templates that make positioning really easy. I'll also show you how to use those during the positioning part of this demonstration. Before we do that though, I want to make a couple of checks on the miter saw to make sure that we're plumb and square. Now what you'll need to check plumb and square is a machinist square like this and also a plastic triangle. First thing I want to do is make sure that the blade is at 90 degrees to the table. So to do that, I just take my square and lay it on the table and up against the blade and make sure that I'm 90 degrees, and in this case I am. While the blade is still locked down, I can take my plastic triangle and put it up against the fence and make sure that its 90-degree leg lays even with the blade, and it does. Now, if you find your blade is not 90 degrees to the fence, check your owner's manual to find out where the adjustment points are and make those adjustments before you start. All right, now to start, you'll just need a 3-foot piece of crown. I've marked this in the middle already. What I'm going to do is just cut the first piece in half. Now you've got 2 pieces. On one of those pieces, take a magic marker like this and mark the top edge. Now remember, most of the ornamentation on crown molding is normally towards the bottom. So we're going to take a magic marker and just mark the top edge on one piece of crown like this. On the other piece of crown, I'm going to take that same marker, but in this case, mark the crown on the bottom edge. Let's start with the one on the top first. We're going to press that up against the back because the black mark always goes up against the fence. I want to tilt my bevel to 33.9, and I'm going to slide my miter in this case towards me at 31.6. And all I'm going to do now is cut this piece of trim in half. Now, you have no idea what you've just made, but let's set these off to the side and take the other piece of crown and cut it. And remember, this is the one with the black mark on the bottom of the trim. The black mark always goes up against the fence. We're leaving the bevel setting at 33.9, and since we had the miter gauge set on my side last time, we're going to slide it to the other side at 31.6 this time, and we're going to cut that in half. So here's how we do it. And now to mark these. Here are your 4 pieces. Find your 2 outside corners. In this case, this is what we have. This would be our left outside corner. This would be our right outside corner. So let's mark this one first. This would be our left outside corner. And this then, of course, would be our right outside corner. Here's our inside corners. This is the way they'd be sitting on the wall. So in this case, we have our left inside corner, and this is our right inside corner. So let's take the left again and mark left inside corner, and lastly, right inside corner. Now what you've created is a full set of templates. These will help you position your trim on the saw, and it'll also be used for the installation process. Let me show you how this works. Here is a right inside corner. And if you notice in this case, the mark is on the bottom side of the trim. That always goes up against the fence. My bevel setting stays at 33.9. And in this case, you can see I have to rotate the miter setting to the left side, and there's my cut. And replacing this piece with the new trim set at the same orientation will allow me to cut that trim perfectly. Now let's just say we're going to create a right outside corner. That's marked on the back. Again, mark is on the top edge. That black mark always goes up against the fence. Bevel stays at 33.9. In this case, we have to rotate the trim to 31.6 on this side. You'll notice that that is the correct cut. You should never place your trim on the saw incorrectly. Now that you've got these templates, let's talk about some real-life crown molding. Now let's review the placing of crown molding in a typical room. The way I like to do it is, the wall that I start crowning first is the wall opposite the door that I walk into. I've made a small little cutout here using some relatively standard construction practices to make this a little bit easier. This is the crown we're going to be using. This is 3.5-inch crown molding, and I want to measure where this is going to drop onto the wall around the room, and this is how I do it. Take this piece of crown molding and set it up against the wall flat, and slide it until it touches the ceiling. So in this case, we're lying flat here, and it's touched up against the ceiling, and put a small pencil mark in that spot. Now take a measurement and see how far that pencil mark comes. And we're at about 2 3/4 of an inch. I want to replicate that same mark all the way around the room. Make it a little easier. I'm just going to use an adjustable square. That was at 2 3/4 of an inch. So I'm going to set my square at 2 3/4 of an inch, and by placing this all the way around the room, I'm just going to place pencil marks all the way around. Now I'm putting pencil marks in here because I don't want to use a chalk line. You would think a chalk line would be a good idea, and it will provide a nice straight line, but you'll never get that chalk out of the paint when you paint. So a pencil line works really well. And I want you to do one more thing. Take some small finishing nails like these. These are 4-penny finishing nails. And every place that you put a pencil mark, I want you to put a nail. And it only needs to go into the drywall. What this pencil line is going to do is establish the place where the trim is going to sit, and it's also going to make it much easier for you to support your tape measure when you're measuring around the room. We've established where the trim is going to sit. The object now is to start putting trim on this first wall. Take your 2 pieces of trim, these inside corners. These are the ones that you made not long ago. So we put them like this. This is how they're going to go on the wall. The first piece of trim that you want to put on this wall would be your right inside corner. That's this piece of trim. That's also marked right inside corner. What you're going to do now is take this to your miter saw, and I'll show you how to cut your first piece of trim there. Now this is our piece of trim. Remember, it was our right inside corner. Here's our mark. That mark always goes up against the fence. In this case, it's at the bottom of the trim. So that's how it fits. We have to now align the saw. So I'm going to tilt the bevel to 33.9, and wherever we're doing 90-degree corners, the bevel always stays there. And you'll notice that what we've got to do is slide the miter to the left to match the cut. So this is exactly how the saw needs to be set up. I take my clean piece of trim, my new one, and as long as I match that trim the same way on the fence, again, bottom side up against the fence, I know that it's positioned correctly. So I'll slide this all the way to one end and make my cut. Now I'm fairly comfortable holding the trim in this spot, but if you're not, the nice part about using the miter saw flat is that you can use a clamp like this to hold it. So now that I've got it positioned correctly, let's cut the trim. Now we've made that first cut on this end, and now it's important to make this cut. Again, looking at your 2 sample pieces, this would be the corner you're cutting. In this case, it's the left inside corner. But I need to know what the measurement is across this. A lot of people would use a tape measure, and I'm not a real big tape measure fan, and I'll explain why. When you put the tape in one corner, you have to press it up into the other one and kind of guess where that tape is going to make the fold. It can make it sometimes a little tough, especially when you're measuring exact edges. I'm a big believer in the old folding rules. By taking a folding rule like this and sliding it up against one edge until it touches and extending the slide on the opposite side, I can look and I have 31 inches here. I have 1 1/16 inches on that side, so I have 32 1/16 of an inch. It makes it really easy to measure. And now that I know that, I can take this piece of trim and on it mark 32 1/16 of an inch. Now to that trim, I'm going to add a 32nd of an inch. I just like to put a little plus on there so it kind of reminds me. Now here's the template for the other side of the wall. This is our left inside corner, and in this case, the mark is at the top of the trim. So what I want to do is position my saw to make that cut. We've left the bevel at 33.9, and you'll notice with the trim up against the fence, I have to slide the miter around to the opposite side so that this is the new cut. And by taking my piece of trim we've already cut, putting it back on the saw in the same direction the first one was on there, I'm all ready to make the cut. And I need to know now where the mark is going to be. The nice part is that at the wall, you mark this template with 32 inches and 1/16 of an inch. And again, I like to add about a 32nd of an inch just to provide a little tension on that cut. Now that I've got it here, I measure from the outside end that I previously cut to the position on the trim here where the new cut's going to be made, and I have all of it done for me. It really makes using these templates simple. So we have 32 1/16 of an inch on my folding rule. I set one edge to the end of the trim like this. I bring this out at 32 1/16 right here, and I want to add about a 32nd of an inch, so there's my line. Now when you make this cut, it's sometimes hard to visualize about where that blade is going to come in and impact the trim. So my suggestion here is that you cut that a little bit fat to start with. That way, after you've cut it, you can kind of see how much you have to move it. After you've used the saw for a while, you get a little bit more comfortable in making these cuts. So let's make this first one, and we'll see where we are. And now we're showing us that we're fat. And then what I'll do is scoot it over and make another cut. And now I've got our piece cut. It's time to go fit it on the wall. Now I've got our piece cut. Let's get it in the opening here. See how it sits on these nails nicely. This fits pretty well. Normally I like to have this piece nice and tight. On a longer wall, I would have fitted one corner, pulled the piece of trim out a little bit to allow the other corner to go in, and when I push it in, it snaps in and actually holds it real well. It's a little bit tough to recreate on this small little cutaway, but you've got the idea here. And now let's put a couple nails in here to hold this together. Now you probably noticed that I didn't look for studs when I was nailing that piece of trim up there before. When you're using 3.5 inch trim like this, to be honest, you really don't have to. And let me show you why. On this cutaway, I'm going to put a piece of trim like this up in the corner, and you'll see how it sits on the wall. If I put a nail up through the corner of this, which is what I did, the nail goes into a double 2x4 on the ends. This is standard construction. You have 2x4 studs like this, and you have double 2x4s all the way around the room, over every door and every window. So by nailing through this corner, the nails will penetrate those studs every place. It's perfect. The only place that you won't have that ability is when you're doing bigger trim like this. And some of these get really large. A piece of trim sitting like this, a nail through this corner, has an awful lot of area between here and the wood stud. You may not be able to find a place to get a good purchase. So you may have to look for the vertical studs in this case, or provide a batten strip, a little wood batting, all the way around the room to give you a little bit more wood surface area behind this piece of trim. And lastly, as long as we're talking about it, there's no need to nail up at the top of that trim. In fact, in many cases, you're going to find that the roof rafters or the ceiling joists are running parallel to those two walls, so there's nothing to nail to. The nails that you put in this edge will pull that piece of trim up nice and tight. And whatever irregularities you find there are going to be covered by caulk anyway. Now that we've got the first piece up on the wall, it's time to continue both other walls. I'll start on this side. You're taking your same pieces of trim like this. This is the piece you want to cut. We're going to go back to our miter saw again and do right inside corner. The bottom edge goes up against the saw just the same way that we did. And once you've cut it, this is how that piece of trim is going to sit up in that corner. We'll repeat the same thing for the other side, and as you walk around the walls, that's how you finish this. Now you've got all your trim nailed up. It's time to remove these positioning nails like this, and don't worry about the holes that are in there. They're going to be covered by caulk. In fact, I like to caulk these because as the studs and rafters have a tendency to push the drywall or plaster away, you get some unevenness between the edge of this trim and the ceiling, and caulk takes up for that. A small tip of the caulk is plenty. Don't really cut it back. I'm going to put a small bead between the wall and the bottom of the trim, like this, and do the same at the opposite end. I like to try and do about as much as I can reach when I'm sitting on a ladder. and then clean up that trim. I like to keep a little pail of water there, wet my fingers, and just push that caulk right into the openings. Now also, while you're here, any of the excess caulk here before you wipe it off, you can take that and then put that in each one of those little nail holes as you work your way around the room. Nail holes, if they're fairly deep, may dry a little bit and pull some of that caulk in. You may have to go back and touch it up, but it's a great way to work your way around the room and provide a great surface after which you're going to paint. Just a perfect way to put caulk up and trim. Now here's another way to install crown molding. We're going to put that first piece up on the back wall exactly the way we did before, but instead of mitering the corners, we're going to flush cut them. So we'll fit them at both ends, spring fit them in, and put the nails in. When we go to place this corner, we again go back to our templates. So we're looking at right inside corner. Instead of mitering this corner to go in the edge, we're going to actually cope this corner. This then nestles onto the first piece of trim instead of mitering up next to it. This is the method that professionals use to do crown molding. And the reason that they use it is that most corners are not 90 degrees. There's some variance of that, and by putting a piece of trim that's been coped up to the square edge of a piece of trim, you'll find that you've got a little bit of room there to go between 89 and say 91 degrees. And the process is really easy. We're still going to use this same piece of trim. This is still right inside corner. We're still going to miter it at the same way on the miter saw, but in this case we're going to use a coping saw and trim this piece of material off and back cut it. Let me show you how that's done. Now here's this edge we want to remove, and I'm going to do that with the coping saw. To make this edge a little bit easier to visualize, one of the ways to do it is just take a pencil like this, and you can kind of scribe out the edge with a little pencil line. Makes it easier to visualize. And now to do this, this is how I'm going to use the coping saw. I'm going to use a coping saw to remove the fat part of this trim, but I don't want the cut to be straight up and down. I actually want to angle the saw just a little bit to the back. This gives me a little bit more room to play. So here's how you cut it. Well, let's just see how this piece works. Here is how that cope joint fits into the corner. Now you can always tweak this joint with either a 4-in-1 file like this, or maybe the blade from a razor knife until you're happy with the fit. But most people will be pretty happy with the way that that fits. The more comfortable you become at cutting crown molding, the less daunting some of these angles will be. In this small mock-up, we're suggesting that maybe the ends here go around the pilasters, around a fireplace. And you'll notice that these are just a series of inside and outside corners. The real problem, it seems, would be cutting something this small. When you look at it, that little edge is just a series of outside corners with an inside corner on the other side. So really, when you look at it, this piece is one that I want to make 3/4 of an inch wide, and that will transition from this edge to the other one. It's a lot easier than you think, Let's go to the miter saw and I'll show you how to do it. Now here's that piece we're going to cut. This is left outside corner. And again, here's our mark that always goes up against the fence. I'm already set at 33.9. I'm going to slide my miter over to 31.6 on the other side, and that is the cut for this. And as long as I've got it there, I'm just going to slide this piece of trim up until it touches the saw blade body, and then I'm going to leave it there. Now I want to make this piece 3/4 of an inch long. Normally the backs of these, you may find them, they have indexing scales on them. This doesn't have anything, so let's make one of our own. I'm going to put a pencil line on this piece of trim, and I'm going to extend that pencil line up the back side. Because I want to cut a piece off that's 3/4 of an inch. I'm going to extend the pencil line I just wrote there to 3/4 here, and I'm going to put another line 1/8 of an inch away from that. So here's how this works. I'm going to take our original lines and I'm going to slide my piece closer to the blade, to that 3/4 inch mark. And because I know that this is 1/8 of an inch blade, I'm going to put it 1/8 of an inch closer. When I cut this piece of trim, because it's laying flat, watch what happens to this piece. That piece stayed right there. It's a great way to cut trim. Now while I'm holding this prop, let's talk about one more trick with crown molding. Let's just say you have a wall that either ends into another room or goes up a set of stairs where you don't want to continue the crown. It's real easy to stop the crown there, and rather than put a small block in, put a small piece of that crown that forms a nice close. The way to do that is, if we look at this prop, this is our outside corner. By taking the mating outside corner and setting up your miter saw to cut it just at 90 degrees from the bottom up, you'll provide a piece that slips perfectly into that end, providing a beautiful close to the crown. Okay. I'm just going to assemble it in this corner. Now let's talk about installing outside corner. You've got your two templates. They're already marked left outside corner and right, and they've got the appropriate markings for your miter saw, and you're going to cut them the same way. But when you place them on the corners, here's where the little difference is. I want you to place these and glue them so that they fit at 90 degrees. Don't try and make adjustments for the fact that the corner is not exactly square, and here's why. With your framing and drywall work, the corner is nice and square. But as we add the bead and the mud that forms that corner, you're going to find that those corners normally aren't square. Once you get past the edge of that mud, they are again. It's very hard to cut miters that have that kind of sweep embedded into them. So the suggestion is, put your miters together at 90. Set your nails way back from that corner and just glue these together. After this all sets and the glue is dried well, you can sneak nails in a little bit closer, and any irregularities on the other side are going to be taken care of by caulk, just like we talked about before. And lastly, resist the urge to put a nail in the side to hold these pieces of trim together. In many cases it may work, but ultimately you're going to have a nail that blows out through the side of the trim. Trying to friction that off, the dents and the holes it creates are just not worth it. Glue the joint together, keep the nails away from the outside until the glue sets up well, sneak your nails a little closer, and use your caulk to take up those irregularities. You'll have a beautiful 90-degree corner and no one will see it. Now let's talk about corners that are not 90 degrees for a reason. Here's our 90-degree corner. But let's just say in your kitchen, the wall moves out to go around a bay window or maybe around a refrigerator cabinet. And let's just say that wall moves out like this. We're going to take this little angle finder and lock it in place to show where that angle is. And by looking at this, we'll see it says 135 degrees. You're still going to use your templates to cut that edge. So in effect, these have bridged out this way. I'm still planning in this case to do a right outside corner. Let's go to the miter saw and I'll show you how to set this up. This is our piece of right outside corner. What we're going to do is put this on the saw the same way we normally would. The mark is at the top of this, that goes up against the fence. Now the markings here at 33.9 and 31.6 would normally have cut this at a 90. But that angle, if you remember, has been changed to 135. So what I'm going to do is change those two markings to be able to cut this piece of trim so that when it sits on the wall, it sits at a 135 degree angle. To get those measurements, All you need to do is Google crown molding angles. There are a number of sites that will show you differences in angles between 67 degrees and 180. In this particular case, if I look at 135, I see that our miter setting is at 14.3 and our bevel setting is at 17.5. Here's how this is done. Now, we originally started with 33.9. I'm just going to tighten this to 17.5, right about here. And I'm going to take our miter bevel setting that was at 31.6, and I'm going to move that to 14.3. And here it is there. Now again, get as close as you can. I know that the markings aren't that distinct. This piece of trim will show you where to place the fresh one. Place your fresh piece of trim, in this case with the top edge up against the fence, and cut it. That resulting cut will provide, when sitting at 38 degrees, a 135-degree angle. It's just that easy. Well, now you've learned all the techniques it takes to install crown molding. And you've seen how templates will let you place that crown molding on your miter saw with no problem at all. And you've seen how cutting crown molding flat will make stabilizing long pieces, cutting real wide pieces or real short pieces really easy. Now, you're not going to generate much scrap, but you are going to generate some. Here's a project I made out of scrap material. Let your mind wander with the number of things that you can make. Now go out and crown something.